Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Fireside Chats with the Library Company of Philadelphia. My name is Emily Guthrie, and I'm librarian for the Library Company, and I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Maren Odle. Dr. Odle is Associate Professor of American Studies and the Director of Graduate Studies at Alabama State University. Her research areas include Native American history, the history of the body, 17th and 18th century America, cross-cultural encounter, and Native representation in pop culture. Dr. Odle received her PhD from New York University, and she was a Library Company Fellow, Andrew W. Mellon Foundation Fellow in 2012 and 2013. Well, she has written about topics ranging from a scalp in Du Cimetiere's American Museum, the history of tattoo removal, and the depiction of scalping in the movie The Revenant. Her talk tonight focuses on her book, Under the Skin: Tattoos, Scalps, and the Contested Language of Bodies in America. The book was published by the University of Pennsylvania Press in 2022 and won the Society of Colonial Wars Fellowship that same year. Maren, we're so glad that you could join us tonight. Please take it away.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Allison, for the invitation and for coordinating this. And thank you, Emily, for hosting this evening. I'm really delighted to be doing something with the Library Company and really grateful for that fellowship almost a decade ago now. So a huge help as I was working on the initial part of this project. So I'm speaking to you all today from Birmingham, Alabama, my hometown, or my home at this point, not my hometown in the sense of this is not where I was born, which is in Muskogee homelands. And I work and teach, as Emily was saying, at the University of Alabama, which is built on Choctaw homelands in West Alabama, about an hour west of here. So today I thought I would discuss sort of the broad outlines of my recent book. And then I'm actually going to turn to some material that didn't make it into Under the Skin. I'm actually going to talk about a very interesting pamphlet that I first saw at the Library Company during my fellowship, something that I keep coming back to and that I hope will be in an article here soon. I'm going to discuss in that second half, when I turn to that pamphlet, I'm going to be discussing how scalp bounties came to be used by British colonies as a part of their military and bureaucratic management, and some of the sort of unintended, the intended and unintended consequences of that. And I should also just clarify that I will not be showing any photos of actual scalps or human remains today, just to be clear. So for any audience members for whom that might be sensitive. So I would like to start by just telling a story about where this book came from, because it actually started at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, right next door to the Library Company. In August of 1763, a group of 114 Pennsylvania colonists passed through Fort Augusta, the British garrison at the forks of the Susquehanna, as you can see, the sort of red dot in the middle of this map. They were announcing their intention to attack and destroy some native towns further upriver. The men stationed at the fort attempted to get them to turn back, since those they were planning to target, Munsee Lenapes, who are often called Delawares, living at a place called the Great Island, the other red dot on this map at your top left, were publicly friendly to Pennsylvania. The colonists ignored the garrison and they pressed onward, but soon got separated into groups in the confusion of nightfall. 2 days later, one of these groups, led by a man named George Allen, returned with a number of furs, trade items, and 4 scalps. Their stories were triumphant but pretty vague, and it soon emerged that the group had actually happened across 3 native men returning from Bethlehem with trade goods. The colonists had taken the 3 men prisoner, then changed their minds and decided instead to kill and scalp them in hopes of receiving a bounty. Originally, the leader, George Allen, had ordered that the prisoners be taken back to Fort Augusta. Others in the group had angrily objected. One said, "I told him if we do that, perhaps they'll let them go. or send them to Philadelphia, where they'd be used better than ourselves by the Quakers. One of the men later recalled how they had overruled Allen. Said Allen, "Would you kill them yourself? You can get no person here to help you." "There is enough," said I, "that will help me to kill them." What these men didn't mention at Fort Augusta as they showed off the rifles, clothing, and scalps that they had acquired was that one of the scalps belonged to a man who was still alive, somewhere in the woods near the great island of the Susquehanna. One of the men in the party had returned to the dead bodies in order to plunder further clothing and goods. As he was beginning to remove one man's leggings, he was shocked when the supposed corpse jumped up and fled, bleeding profusely. The attackers were so surprised at his raising from the dead, as they put it, that they failed to pursue the survivor. This native man would later say that he used moss and his remaining legging to bind his wound, as he reportedly said, quote, "to keep the hot sun from beating in upon his brains." His name, like that of the officer in charge of the colonists, was given in some sources as George Allen. These two men, assailant and survivor, were almost certainly known to one another. And their shared name, I think, suggests the possibility that they may have even sort of traded names in earlier times as a sign of friendship. The survivor supposedly threatened to take revenge, but there's no evidence that he ever had the opportunity for reprisal. The Pennsylvanians went on to receive 100 pounds in bounties from the government for the scalps, which were, and I think this is an interesting detail, reported as 4 in number rather than 3, a discrepancy that suggests that the group had subdivided one of the scalps in order to fraudulently inflate their reward. Most of the colonial accounts of this incident described the native George Allen and his 2 murdered traveling companions merely as quote unquote enemy Indians. The payment of the award indicated that the colony's government accepted the flimsy premise put forward by the attackers. And so, like I said, when I first encountered this story, I was actually a college student, an undergraduate, doing research at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. And it took my breath away. Coming across this story in one of their books, there were so many layers, right? These very human elements of betrayal and greed and suffering. There was this horrific act of violence that, until I had read this, I hadn't realized someone could experience and survive. That was news to me at that time. And there was, of course, the deep irony of including this Indigenous man's story of being brutally attacked by vigilante settlers in a book that claimed to describe, as it put it, Indian outrages against settlers, against colonists. So all of the little fault lines here in this story started to raise questions for me. How did this duplicity, how did this sort of brutal act on the part of these settlers come to be revealed? Who cracks and tells the real story to the garrison? How did the survivor's account kind of come back into view of colonial audiences? How and why is his voice included in this story, which is published for Pennsylvania audiences, several decades after it happens? Who did he speak to? Where did he go? And so some of that aftermath is knowable, but of course, much of it isn't. But this story sat with me for many years, and all the sort of research challenges of it, all the sort of questions it raised. And I ultimately found myself trying to unpack it in this larger project about body modification and physical appearance, and what those things meant for relationships between natives and newcomers in early America. So as part of their contests for power, colonial and indigenous societies made many attempts to transform one another's appearance. They might change their clothes, cut hair, pierce or stretch ears, or remove earrings, apply or remove paint and makeup, and as well as deploying violent acts which maimed, mutilated, and marked both the dead and the living. And what I found in writing this book was that traces on the body of these incidents could prompt panic and hostility, curiosity, desire, mockery, or wonder. Most importantly, though, I think they prompted new stories about which types of difference mattered and how to create or erase those differences. So studying the marks on early American bodies makes visible to us a world of signs. In an era characterized by increasing long-distance travel, imperial expansion, and the circulation of tales and images of strange people and strange places, it was really crucial to be able to answer questions like, who are you? What are your allegiances? And what does your appearance tell us about you and about the people you've met and the places you've been? So my book looks at two types of body transformations side by side, scalping and tattooing. And as many people have pointed out to me, those are very different marks. I know. But they do share a few characteristics. Both were painful and permanent. There are also two practices which settler newcomers closely associated with the Indigenous societies of North America. Despite or because of their associations with indigeneity, both practices were adopted by newcomers, who in turn assigned their own meanings to the practices, marks, and trophies produced by tattoos and scalp taking. Euro-Americans debated, were Indigenous tattoos a very admirable system, a sort of clear-cut way of acknowledging and honoring, accomplishment, or were they a sign of foolish vanity? Was scalping a repulsively brutal act whose perpetrators were fundamentally uncivilized? Or was it merely another tactic to add to newcomers' arsenals? Regardless of these interpretations, on non-native bodies, both marks were thought to be clear signals of interactions with native people. And among native peoples, of course, the meaning and symbolism of these practices shifted over time, in part because they were being adopted and transformed by Euro-Americans. So this book became about embodied experience, but also about how narratives got created to explain those experiences, particularly narratives that generate and perpetuate what I call in the book settler logics. And by that, I just mean stories and images that emerge from colonial discourse, which are trying to describe native societies in such ways as to produce racialized identities and are kind of attempting to naturalize and legitimize the claims of newcomers. And I'm not the first scholar to say this. This is sort of a thread that a lot of people have pulled on. As people have written, settler states often depend on images of indigeneity, even as they're attempting to eliminate Indigenous people and Indigenous sovereignty. So Indigenous customs, and in particular, intimate, painful practices which remade the body, whether by violence or by ornamentation, the subjects of this book, could be co-opted as ideological resources by colonizing powers. And this book considers first tattooing, which is a practice with its own deep history in Europe. And that's something that I think is really fascinating and worth kind of running side by side with Indigenous tattooing. And then it turns to scalping, a practice which was unfamiliar to most Europeans, but had clear parallels to their own forms of trophy taking and ritual violence. So as you can see in some of the images that I've been showing here and throwing up on the screen, some of the earliest English observations of Native North Americans were very attentive to tattooing. So as you can see in this 1590 engraving, this artist's work is reflecting English interests in particular in determining how status and hierarchy could be demarcated physically and visually, and trying to sort of use these tattoos as almost a cheat sheet to know people's political allegiances. So here, these are described as marks of the sundry of the chief men of Virginia. So these tattoos here are being kind of ascribed as, like I said, almost political, state-based allegiances. They show you which prince you owe your allegiance to in the text that goes with this image. And these were very popular, very widely circulated engravings. They were published alongside a description of the so-called Newfound Land of Virginia. And in both the art and in the text, so in the writing that goes along with this, we see the English really grappling with the possibility that Indigenous tattoos might be communication systems that are similar, if not quite the same as writing, their own systems of writing. And this is something that they're fascinated and a little bit scared about because of what it might say about their own presumed claims about kind of cultural superiority. And so one of the things I'm fascinated by and really try to think through in this book is how these early encounters become negotiations about how to define writing and reading, and also about how to translate the supposedly inherent language of the body. I also think in this text about cross-cultural tattoos, particularly on men with military experience, since soldiers and officers were some of the most likely Euro-American groups to receive native tattoos. Sometimes it's a memento of their travels, at other times it's a part of diplomatic outreach and alliance building. And so that takes us to the other aspect of warfare in early America that makes an appearance in this book, which is scalping. I, in this book, studied the colonial introduction of bounties for native scalps and found that the offer of a price for this body part, perhaps unsurprisingly, dramatically reshaped the scale and significance of the practice of scalping. Bounties transformed an Indigenous trophy-taking practice into a financial incentive for colonial violence. So for those of you who are maybe less familiar with this, scalping is a trophy-taking practice of cutting and pulling off the hair and skin of a fallen enemy's head. There's ancient, interestingly enough, scalping was widely but not universally used in North American Indigenous warfare. And in that it's functioning as a sort of tangible proof of success in war, it's also a means of acquiring the spiritual strength and courage of the person who's been killed or defeated. And scalps themselves were these very powerful objects. They could be worn, used in rituals, or displayed. And so, as you can see in the drawing here, the first figure, the man who's returning home here, is carrying two scalps. They're labeled F and E on the pole that he's carrying over his shoulder. But bounties for scalps, which appear in English colonies during the late 17th century, are going to fundamentally change some aspects of this. They're emerging from two much older traditions, taking war trophies, which is fairly ubiquitous around the world, and offering rewards for an enemy's capture or death. And so while scalping was maybe unfamiliar to them as newcomers in the Americas, that's really only in its particulars. Its role as trophy taking would have resonated with a number of other dismemberment practices that were widespread in Europe. So by offering money for ritual objects that had been displayed or used as gift exchanges, European colonists are significantly transforming the practice of scalping. The ways that scalps were priced, displayed, and circulated, and the ways that bounties affected diplomacy and debates about the ethics of war prove very revealing about broader colonial discussions of how to value Native people, whether as labor, as consumers, as military allies, or in the case of the story I'm telling in this book, as body parts. And in particular, I argue in the book that fears of fraud reflected Euro-American ideas about the unknowability of scalp origins, even as they're drafting and writing these bounty protocols that are relying on assumptions about age, gender, and ethnic origin of these body parts. And one of the things that I found is that over and over again, narratives are required from bounty petitioners in order to prove that scalps are taken legitimately in lieu of other evidence that seems reliable to colonial eyes. And I think it's so fascinating that these tangible human remains taken as trophies are not enough to receive awards under these systems. They require storytelling. And narratives fill in the spaces of anonymity and uncertainty that scalps generate. But one of the things I'm arguing here is that ambiguity ends up sort of being the point over and over again. Ambiguity in who might be targeted, ambiguity in whether scalps were even proof of death, and ambiguity in whether awards would even be administered as promised, which they frequently weren't. And let me just say here, this image of Hannah Dustin, this is a statue in New Hampshire, I'm showing it here. She is best remembered for escaping from captivity in 1697, and in doing so, killing and scalping 10 Indigenous men, women, and children. She's also the first non-allegorical woman to receive statues in her honor in the United States. So this sort of very interesting moment in the late 19th century where she gets held up as this heroine, right? And she has multiple statues in her honor in New Hampshire and Massachusetts. And the items that are in her left hand, as you can see in this image here, it's a little hard to see perhaps, those are meant to be the scalps that she takes. So this very tangible public monument to this act of violence. So I'm going to explore in the second half of this talk more about this idea that storytelling, that sort of narrative justification mattered for the tactical choices in colonial wars, as well as in the sort of public conversations that are happening, especially in the 18th century, about legitimate and illegitimate violence. Who could perform it? Who could be targeted by it? And this is where I get to talk a little bit about some of the interesting things in the library company's collections. So while other British colonies in North America had offered numerous scalp bounties during times of conflict, in the 17th century, Pennsylvania, which I'm going to focus on here, doesn't adopt the practice until the beginning of the 7 Years' War in the middle of the 18th century. And as many of you in the audience probably know, especially if you are in Philly or in the greater Pennsylvania area, prior to the outbreak of that conflict, Pennsylvania's inhabitants had very much prided themselves on using diplomacy to avoid widespread violence between the region's native nations and the colony, which makes the decision of Pennsylvania's leadership to offer scalp bounties at 3 different points in 1756, 1764, and 1780, I think all the more striking that they do finally make this move at that sort of midpoint in the 18th century. So in 1755, the colony's primary negotiator with Native nations, a man named Conrad Weiser, wrote an urgent letter to Governor Robert Hunter Morris. And Weiser's described an alarming encounter with settlers in Berks County. They want to force us to make a law that they should have a reward for every Indian which they kill. They demanded such a law of us, with their guns cocked, pointing it towards us. Cornered, Weiser had agreed with the other local leaders to, quote, promise them a reward for every Indian man they should kill. So there was not only political, but even physical danger in neglecting their demands, as he explained to the governor. Quote, the people are so incensed against the governor and assembly that we are afeared they will go down in a body to Philadelphia and commit the vilest outrages. These demands for reimbursed killing and these promises of payment affected the political and diplomatic decisions of Pennsylvania and other Mid-Atlantic colonies and the area's native nations during the period. Bounties prompted much debate about their effectiveness, about the morality of scalping, and about the impact of bounties on native and colonial coexistence in the region. Rather than effectively protecting the colony, the bounty offers instead created diplomatic quandaries and raised the fear of fraud. The 7 Years' War sparked enthusiasm in some circles for these bounties, while others questioned the appropriateness of scalping and especially of paying for scalps as techniques of war. There were long-standing questions among colonists about what would constitute ethical practice in a war against Native nations. Did Native opponents deserve to be treated fairly by European standards of war? Native warfare at times seemed shocking and cruel to Euro-Americans, but the reverse was also true, with European practices outraging and alienating Native observers. The differences in military cultures seemed to undermine the moral and ethical claims of opponents to humane treatment. So one anonymous pamphlet, Proposals to Prevent Scalping, published in 1755, is in the library company's collections, where I first saw it when I had my fellowship there about a decade ago. This fascinating pamphlet took a stance against scalp bounties, even while it urged reprisals for what it called the present deplorable condition of our back settlements. Can anything be more shocking, the author asked, than to see even amongst ourselves laws established and proclamations published with rewards for the murder of poor women and innocent children, and that in a country professing Christianity? While the pamphlet urged that the shocking practice of bounties for native scalps should stop, it did so less from ethical considerations than from concern that the tactic was misdirected and ineffective. Its author dismissed the idea of meaningful retribution against native fighters, writing, "You might with equal propriety issue orders of reprisals against hawks and owls." Instead, the pamphlet urged harsh alternative punishments aimed at the French. The French, contended the writer, were far more culpable for devastating backcountry attacks than Indians, who were merely employed by the French in the nature of mercenaries, and therefore were not responsible for tactical decisions. The implication of the text was that native fighters were not only not responsible for decisions of how and where to go to war, but that they lacked moral reasoning to weigh the cruelty or justice of their behavior, that they were like birds of prey. They might act contrary to the laws of war or even of nature, as the author of this pamphlet said, but they possessed insufficient understanding of either category to be dissuaded by bounties. Only French and Canadian soldiers could be accountable. The violent impulses of native fighters ought to have been controlled by their French employers, the pamphlet argued, and since they'd failed to do so, French prisoners were the ones who should experience reprisals. Suggestions offered by the pamphleteer also involve bodily mutilations, but those with more familiar European pedigrees. Enemy prisoners ought to be punished with the amputation of their right hands or thumbs for the deaths of non-combatants, particularly of women. The author also urged that Frenchmen found in raiding parties have their eyes gouged out. For those who daily deserve death and daily expect it, the author concluded, death would lose its power to terrify, whereas by mutilation, they may live to repent and would serve as warnings to others. By urging the use of these tactics against opponents of European heritage, the author of Proposals to Prevent Scalping hoped to undermine the colonial use of bounties, which seemed too closely to embrace fighting in the Indian's own way, that is, to scalp and murder, as this person wrote. Perceptions that warfare was civilized mattered. The pamphlet worried about bounties. What must strangers think of such a law? But its author did not worry, apparently, over what strangers might think of amputations and blindings. In the midst of such ongoing debates, Pennsylvania moved ahead to issue its first scalp bounty. So in 1756, Governor Morris announced that awards were available to both natives and Christians, as he put it, for pursuing, taking, killing, and destroying hostile Delawares, designated by the colony's proclamation as enemies, rebels, and traitors. A few days before, Governor Morris and his council had reviewed treaties between the colony and the Lenape and had concluded that the Delaware nation were the subjects of His Majesty and therefore in rebellion. Yet Pennsylvania referred to the proclamation as a declaration of war, suggesting that Native nations were also perceived as separate sovereign entities, and this is a distinction that actually matters. Efforts to fix the status of Native Americans in relation to the British Empire were connected to efforts to legitimize certain types of violence. Was authorizing scalping and bounties suitable for imperial subjects, or for foreigners, or for both? The proclamation not only struggled with specifying the nature of the conflict, is this a war, is this a rebellion, but also with locating its targets. Geographic boundaries and tribal designations were both used in an effort to decide who might be an enemy. The council, aware of, as they put it, difficulties about the manner of wording it as to Indians and the Indian country, had asked Conrad Weiser to consult with Haudenosaunee allies. he went to confer with Oneida leader Scariati about the proclamation, hoping to find a geographic or cultural designation that would clearly mark allied Haudenosaunee villages as off limits. But he failed to meet with him and quickly returned, and the governor and a council went ahead with the proclamation anyway. They settled on asking colonists that hostilities not be carried any further north than the Cayuga branch of the Susquehanna River, so creating a sort of geographic line. The proclamation also urged the protection of Delawares who rejected the, quote, ungrateful, cruel, and perfidious behavior of others in their nation, but did so in the vaguest of terms. It merely recommended that the colony assist them. It was not explained who or where these Lenapes were or how they might protect themselves. This may have been because those distinctions seemed obvious to Pennsylvania officials. However, more likely, the ambiguity is intentional. It reflected colonists' suspicion that natives of the region lacked stable, clear-cut identities as either allies or enemies. Many native residents of the region traveled between towns, not considering themselves openly antagonistic to the colony, but also not avoiding or rejecting those communities that might be. Bounty proclamations were trying to force native people to take a side by intimidating and immobilizing them, restricting movement, and undermining connections with their kin. Bounties drew a border between those deemed disposable, those who might be targeted by state-authorized violence, and those who were not. That border was a powerful tool in the hands of authorities who could then assert the right to assign scalps and the stories associated with them to those same categories. So financial and rhetorical values are things that I keep coming back to and keep thinking about, that this book spends a lot of time thinking about the intersections of stories and money and their exchange. So financial and rhetorical values derived from the ways that age, gender, and supposed enemy status could be read into a small piece of skin and hair. Bounties then were deployed by colonies in such a way as to create Indian as an expansive category, one whose boundaries would be determined by colonial authorities. And the result was an ambiguous document that left all local native people vulnerable to bounty hunters. In 1756, Pennsylvania officials still thought of allied Indigenous fighters as a vital defense resource for their colony, hoping to recruit and reward them. Their haphazard framing and application of this first bounty, perhaps unsurprisingly, assisted in unraveling those alliances. Rewards were set on a scale. For male prisoners over 12, one could receive 150 Spanish dollars or pieces of 8. For the scalps of males over 12, or for women and children prisoners, 130 pieces of 8. And for women's scalps, 50 pieces of 8. So kind of moving down a ladder of value. Male scalps and female or child prisoners were worth the same price. And making prisoners and scalps financially equivalent could remove incentives to capture non-combatants. Why, bounty seekers might have wondered, bother? Why try to take a possibly recalcitrant prisoner to a fort or county jail when passing off his or her scalp as that of an adult man's might be easier and more lucrative? Reporting the true origin of a scalp, if, for example, it was a woman's and not a man's, could mean a loss of potential profit and prestige. It was the difference of 80 Spanish dollars and also masculine bragging rights. Those listening and weighing the offer as these proclamations were read out loud, in public, would have been told that for rescuing any English subject that has been taken and carried from this province into captivity, the sum of 150 pieces of 8, but nothing for their scalps. That turning in the scalps of captives rather than rescuing them had to be explicitly forbidden is also a telling sign of how colonies could both desire and distrust the power of bounties to motivate. The idea that settlers would not necessarily attempt to return imprisoned fellow settlers is really striking here. And we know that this happened, that the money offered by the Pennsylvania Proclamation tempted some bounty hunters to step outside the very tenuous boundaries that were laid out in its rules. We know that because a few months later, a Native family was attacked in their house in Perth Amboy while they slept. Despite having registered as quote unquote friend Indians with the government of New Jersey, the family was targeted by locals who intended to take their scalps to Philadelphia and claimed they were enemies who'd been killed in Pennsylvania territory. And a woman named Kate and several of her children died in the attack. Governor Morris declared war on the Delawares despite knowing that Sir William Johnson, the superintendent of Indian affairs from the northern colonies, was attempting to negotiate with them. Unsurprisingly, his unilateral actions infuriated Johnson, who saw the bounty as undermining his diplomatic efforts. Morris attempted to justify himself to Johnson, claiming that, as he put it, the demands of the enraged people had forced him to act. Had I the least notion that they could be stopped in the midst of their furious career, I would not have gratified the people, he wrote. And the furious career that he's referring to there is that of the Delawares, but he might as easily have meant the enraged colonists with their armed threats against officials. Just a few weeks after the proclamation, the Delawares announced that they wanted to meet with Johnson. And Pennsylvania therefore had to set about untangling the diplomatic snarls they'd created. Go-betweens attempted to set up a time and place for a treaty meeting. Having enlisted native messengers to go upriver to Delaware villages, the government immediately encountered the consequences of the problem they'd made. Shortly after the men had set out on their journey, a letter arrived explaining that the native messengers had stopped in Bethlehem and were afraid to proceed any further on account of the danger they apprehended themselves to be in from a party of 100 men who, rumor had it, had set out from New Jersey with a scalping design. So these messengers were trapped in Bethlehem, afraid to go back, afraid to go forward, hemmed in by the uncertain whereabouts of a large scalp hunting group. Letters flew between Philadelphia and local officials. Keep the envoys in the town, William Parsons wrote, while these parties are out, lest they should fall into their hands. He had written a letter to all of His Majesty's justices and other officers, do everything in their power to divert the scalping party from going out if they were not already gone. They were out and ahead of the people seeking to find them. Messengers seeking these men reported that 4 officers with 25 men each set out last Saturday from Paulin's Kill towards the Great Swamp in quest of the Indians. Parsons, in his own letters, tried to find a reason for optimism. It is supposed that their design is rather to take such cattle and effects as they may find with the enemy, rather than to scalp them. And hoping for robbery rather than murder was not much to hang the colony's diplomacy on. He reiterated the need to protect the native envoys, warning that if they were waylaid, it would prove fatal, not only to the present, but to future overtures of peace. Ultimately, the party from New Jersey seems to have drifted homeward with no reported scalps and only severe diplomatic damage done. But as this proved, bounties spilled over colony lines and altered regional political landscapes. Natives and settlers alike might carry scalps far afield in hopes of securing more lucrative rewards for them, or to try to turn illicit and therefore valueless scalps into legitimate ones. Bounties issued by neighboring colonies could pressure other governments into offering their own, and they complicated the divisions of power between imperial officials and colonial ones, like I was just saying about the kind of tension between Governor Morris and William Johnson. In June of 1757, the superintendent of Indian affairs for the southern colonies, Johnson's sort of colleague, Edmund Atkin, wrote to the governor of Maryland and urged him to stop offering scalp bounties to native allies, insisting that there were pernicious consequences flowing from large rewards for scalps. The many temptations for natives to kill others that are our friends, Atkin wrote, made scalp payments detrimental to the complex, often fragile alliance of many native nations that the British hoped to manage. He explained, "A Chickasaw, one of our best friends, had been murdered by Cherokees he'd been traveling with, and his scalp was, quote, hanging exposed in public before my eyes, made into 2 scalps, among the scalps of their enemies, though they know not that I know about the murder." Atkin concluded the motive could only be the scalp reward. He worried too that similar incidents could cause another national quarrel with the Tuscaroras, and told Sharp that he'd found it necessary to have allies guarded during their visits to Winchester, Virginia, because he believed that Cherokees in the town intended to scalp them. This was not only unsettling to diplomacy, it was, according to Atkin, fraud. Scalps are being presented as those of enemies, and furthermore, they were multiplying. Atkin declared, quote, "The Cherokees in particular have got the art of making 4 scalps out of 1 man killed." And they noted that he had seen 20 scalps on display, which were well known to have been made out of 5 Frenchmen. Therefore, he concluded it was necessary to tell native envoys that he would not buy scalps. Atkin described the Cherokees' suspected behavior as private scalping, turning intertribal conflicts into a money-making opportunity at the expense of imperial officials. This description implied there was a contrasting public or civic form of scalping, one that was not driven by individual grievance or selfish financial rationale. And Atkin was willing to concede that some people could perform such acts. If bounties were confined to poor white men, he wrote, it would be very laudable, since the awards might help support those who have been driven from their habitations by the war. But as those rewards are offered to Indians, the case is very different, he concluded. It's notable that Atkin's comments presumed Indigenous untrustworthiness, even as examples of colonial scalping parties endangering diplomacy, attacking non-combatants, and dividing scalps proliferated. His complaints previewed a turn towards racially exclusive language that would specify both who was targeted by bounties and who was eligible for rewards. By 1764, Pennsylvania would declare that only quote-unquote whites could receive payments for scalps. So fraud became ever more associated with allied natives, even as evidence was clear that settlers were also attempting fraudulent bounty claims. While officials were concerned about paying for the wrong scalps, their behavior tacitly acknowledged the usefulness of doubt. Scalping could be used against any native person, whether man, woman, or child, thus targeting both formal enemies and allied or neutral parties. The blurry connection between a scalp and a specific individual, along with the flexible nature of bounty payments, meant that colonial officials could simultaneously disavow scalping when the wrong people were targeted, but also deploy the tactic in expansive ways when it was useful to recruit fighters or to try to control native mobility. The practice thus laid the groundwork for colonial formations of Indianness, I argue, as an identity that could be reduced to an anonymous scalp, so a very racialized and very physical identity. The bounties of 1756 and 1764 had pretty limited official success by the terms of the colony. Only a handful of people submitted scalps for reward, but their political popularity kept the Pennsylvania officials returning to them as policy. In 1779, Joseph Reed, president of the Executive Council, wrote that there was a general reluctance on this subject and an apprehension it may be used by our enemies to a national reproach. The concern, again, of the laws of war sort of resurfacing now because Americans were in open conflict with the British. But by the following year, Pennsylvania had issued its 3rd bounty offer. Americans worried about how their use of bounties might be perceived, but did not hesitate to criticize the British for doing the same thing. The 1780 political cartoon shows the results. Prime Minister Lord North here is depicted cannibalistically gnawing on bones with his Indigenous allies, while the Archbishop of York rushes to bring in boxes of scalping knives. The idea of European culpability for supposed native cruelty, which was the same argument that had led the writer of that anonymous pamphlet to insist that the French should have their eyes gouged out because targeting native fighters would be meaningless, was now being used against British and loyalist forces. Thomas Paine lambasted British military leadership in saying that there was not a more detestable character nor a meaner or more barbarous enemy than the present British one. So was scalping a brutal act whose perpetrators were uncivilized, or a tactic to be added to the arsenal? By the late 18th century, Anglo-Americans found themselves arguing that it was both. The wide-scale Anglo-American use and condemnation of scalping, compared to the intimate particularities that are assigned to tattooing, suggest the distinctive roles that each practice held in the imaginations of newcomers. So in the book's epilogue, I moved to think about the legacies and afterlives of these narratives that early Americans developed around both types of marks. Scalping, I argue, came to claim an ever larger territory in Anglo-American imaginations. It becomes nearly synonymous with nativeness by the late 18th century. Tattooing, on the other hand, continued to intrigue, but dwindled in perceived prominence as a marker of American bodies. So cross-cultural markings have acted, and I think continue to act, as residual memories in American culture, recalling past scenarios of violence, or actually of peaceful accommodation according to the needs and desires of those invoking them. But like memory, markings combine permanency and malleability. In exploring the physical and emotional and social impacts of bodily transformation, we have to grapple with the lived experience of the past. These marks followed people, as that man binding his head wounds with moss and his legging that I mentioned at the beginning of this talk knew from bitter experience. By considering how these marked individuals, their stories, images, and even their body parts circulated under the skin demonstrates that the transformative impact of bodily change revealed for residents of early America the painful, even violent intimacies of contact. Thank you.
Sharon, thank you very much. That was wonderful. I welcome members of the audience to please ask any questions you might have. All questions are great questions, so please put those in the Q&A. But I'm happy to get the Q&A section started. This may be, I fear this is a little bit of a gruesome question, or maybe one that's technical, but scalping seems like a very specific skill, and I'm wondering how colonists kind of knew how to do that, or is that the type of skill that kind of was kind of in alignment with like other skills of that time period, like hunting and preparing animals?
Mm-hmm. I mean, this is a gruesome topic, so it's not a bad question. I think you're right to say that there's a sort of technique or a technical aspect to it as an act of violence and trophy taking. And that actually does come up in a number of sources where people talk about skillfulness required, particularly to do it quickly, and to do it on a battlefield is something that is a learned technique. It's also part of the factor in how and why so many people survive scalping. And this is actually, I didn't touch on that at all, but I have a chapter about scalping survivors, much like the man I started the talk with. And one of the things I found is that people die from other sorts of wounds. I mean, they're dying because they've already been shot, tomahawked, hit in the head, right? Other sorts of things but the scalping itself, again, somebody who's, this is such a strange thing to sort of talk about in terms of technique, but it is somebody who's doing it with some technique. It's a gruesome wound and you're at risk of infection, just like anything else from the period, but people don't necessarily die from it. It's whether you have had injuries to the skull or the brain, underlying tissue. And that doesn't always happen, which is why a lot of people survive, and then they have these very distinctive scar tissue marks on their heads. I mean, it's a whole thing. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm also wondering, I know how difficult it is to find sources that represent the Indigenous perspective or the Indigenous voice, and I was hoping you could talk about your process around that and what effort or attempts you made to incorporate Indigenous voice into your research and writing.
That's such a good question. And I will say that I made a decision fairly early on in this process with this particular book that I think, like I said in the talk, that I found the idea of like settler logics to be a really compelling one. And as a way for me to partly address the very obvious bias or sort of skewing of a lot of the sources that I was coming across. So I was finding all these texts that were, like the example I gave at the beginning, sort of framed as like we're telling these accounts of Indian outrages. They're always about this sort of, very much taking a tack of justifying American expansionism. And then I would read them, and if you read them against the grain, that's not the story at all, of course. And again, something so obvious as this man I started talking about, his story of being violently, brutally out of nowhere, attacked by settlers gets put in a book like that, which is so striking to me. So what I found myself wanting to do in this particular text was to spend a lot of time kind of unraveling some of those narratives. I will say that's not the same thing as restoring or replacing or interweaving Indigenous perspectives as much as I would like. I think that's actually a separate story in some ways, and one that I think, particularly for the tattooing aspect, there are people taking that up and going with it in a different direction. Where possible, I've tried to pull that in. I will say that I have some fascinating examples, and you and I were talking about this before the talk started, particularly about tattooing. There's fascinating hints, even in colonial records, about the ways that Indigenous people are talking and understanding their tattoos. One example I give in the book is a Moravian missionary trying to talk to a much older man who had been a fairly prominent warrior when he was younger, about the tattoos that he has. And he's kind of hoping that he'll give him a whole story because he knows that's actually a very common process. And this man deflects him in this fascinating moment and says, I can't tell you about those. Those were, he says something along the lines of, now that I've been taken captive by Jesus Christ, that was, those are stories from a different person or a different life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it's this fascinating way of seeing how he's interpreting religious conversion. It's also, I think, a really interesting moment of cultural misunderstanding because the Moravian missionary does not understand that these are off limits stories for him. And I think the man is very politely sidestepping that and saying, like, you are not entitled to that. Mm-hmm. So that's also to say that there were things I felt like were also culturally sensitive enough that I didn't think they needed to be in the book or needed to be in my book. Let's put it that way. So there were also things that I was trying to take seriously on that front.
Yeah, wonderful. So this project has been a long time in the making, and I imagine that you are well underway with other projects. Anything you want to tell us about that you're working on?
Oh, well, yeah, that's fun. Yes, this has been a long project. I am very excited to be getting started on a second book project that is actually moving into the 19th century. And this is sort of, I'm very much a generalist at heart, and I keep finding myself skipping around and finding new things. And I was laughingly telling a friend the other day that the 19th century is my least favorite century after the 20th, but I keep getting pulled forward in time. So I keep finding myself moving further and further along in American history. My next book project is looking at the Second Seminole War and the sort of interwoven lives of a handful of people in the Florida borderlands of that period. So there's a settler woman, an Indigenous child, and a formerly enslaved Black sailor. And all of them have their biographies or narratives written about by an English doctor. And I'm fascinated by all four of these people. They move across the Atlantic, they go all over the place. I'm just having a lot of fun thinking about biography and why people get to tell stories about other people. And that includes us as scholars, right? Like, what am I doing when I do that project? And I'm just fascinated to see where it ends up. I've already gotten to go to London and look at archives there. So it's been a lot of fun.
Nice choice. Always good to find a project that takes you overseas.
Yes.
Yeah, it sounds like
Or
the
hopefully
making
back to Philadelphia. At some point.
I hope so. I hope so. Well, it looks like we are just about at time. Would you like to share with the audience how they can reach you if they have information to share, if they have questions about you or your project?
Absolutely. I'm going to jump into the chat. You are welcome, of course, to email me. It's lmodal, and it keeps auto correcting me here because it does not understand my name, at ua.edu. I will also just make a pitch from Penn Press that if you are interested in purchasing my book, please use the discount code so you can get 30% off. It's my last name, Odal, 30. So that should make it quite inexpensive. So
Great. Thank you for that. I highly recommend it. Well, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for participating tonight, and thanks to our audience as well. We hope to see you all back here next month.
Thank you all so much for being here. And yes, I do welcome follow-ups. Please get in touch. It's always lovely to talk.
Great.
Thank you.
Enjoy your evening. Thank you.